Well, welcome to our March History Happy Hour on Zoom. My name is Pete Mealy. I am privileged to serve at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center as Executive Director and concurrently as President of the Seminary Ridge Historic Preservation Foundation. We have been doing these History Happy Hours during Zoom, during Zoom. I spend a lot of time on Zoom, you can tell. During COVID, to keep in touch with our members and our friends and to give you a chance to interact with scholars around topics that they've been working on or have just released, which is what we're doing this evening. Next month, just to give you a little taste of what's coming up next month, we're going to be welcoming historian Stephen Longenecker, who is a professor at Bridgewater College down in Virginia. He wrote in 2014 the book Gettysburg Religion, and he is going to be coming to us on March 18th to offer some thoughts on the intersection of history and theology as part of a new web series that we've just launched called Crossroads of History and Theology. So look for information coming about that in the next couple of weeks. We will be doing an April History Happy Hour. We don't have a topic yet, but we'll get to that. We have a couple of good ideas. And then starting in May, we're going to switch over to doing our walking tours, and we'll do those through the summer months on Seminary Ridge, and then come back and do the History Happy Hour starting again in the fall. So just a couple of other things that are coming up that I want to make sure that we announce. We still have virtual seats available for our symposium, which is going to be next Saturday, a week from tomorrow on February 26th, first day at Gettysburg. Both Codie and I will be speaking, and we'll be joined by James Hessler, Eric Lindblade, and Stuart Dempsey. The Battle of Gettysburg podcast, Jim and Eric are both the hosts of that. And it's going to be a great day looking at the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. So if you are interested, Rob, maybe you can even put the link in the chat. The virtual, the in-person is sold out, but the virtual seats are still available, and you get access to all of the presentations plus the material that will be handed out if you will be here in person. So the only thing you don't get is lunch. Sorry, we're not doing that. But we hope to see some of you there. I know some of you are signed up already. And then maybe most importantly is after almost 3 months, the museum will be opening to the public tomorrow. We're having our grand reopening after being closed since the end of November. So February, we're going to be just open on the weekends. And then starting on March 3rd, we're going to be open Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, with hopes of returning back to a 7-day-a-week schedule sometime this year. So we hope that if you're in Gettysburg, that you will come and see us. And Codie and Caleb have been working on some exciting new programming that you can take advantage of. So we look forward to seeing you on the Ridge. So this is not my show by any means tonight. I've just taken it over for the first 5 minutes, but I'm actually going to turn it over to Codie Eash, who's going to take it from here. So Codie, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Pete, very much. And welcome everyone this evening. Really pleased to have everybody back for another History Happy Hour. We have a wonderful subject this evening. We're going to be discussing a recently published book that I have right here, The Dogs of War in Our Midst, Civil War Perspectives from York County, Pennsylvania. And we are joined by both of the authors of the book, James McClure and Scott Mingus. And I'll introduce our guests here in just a moment. What I want to kind of get us started with here briefly is discussing a bit about why this is a really pertinent topic for us here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. Last summer, Jim emailed me and asked me some questions that he was working on an op-ed for the York Daily Record, and I'll drop the link to the finished product here in the comments in just a moment. Really kind of looking for some of the connections between York County, Adams County's neighbor to the east, and the Gettysburg Seminary and Seminary Ridge. And as the piece's title implies, all roads lead to York at Gettysburg Seminary Ridge Museum. And we can really look at these connections when we start putting them down on paper. The founder of the Lutheran Theological Seminary here in Gettysburg, Samuel Simon Schmucker, has some childhood links to York. Some of the wounded soldiers who were treated in the seminary hospital in the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg are treated at the General Hospital that we'll talk about this evening in York. When you go up to the cupola of the seminary today and take a cupola tour and you look out to the east, we can see the Pigeon Hills in the western portion of York County and other portions up to the north, further toward Dillsburg in northern York County. The sculptor of the John Buford statue, of course, Buford famous for his link to the seminary, the statue just to the west on McPherson Ridge. That sculptor, James Edward Kelly, he interviewed Arthur Farquhar a few decades after the Civil War, the man who is lambasted for surrendering York to the rebels, as a lot of people saw it. And so there are really these kind of innumerable connections that we can make to any of the subjects that we cover here at Seminary Ridge, from the battle and the Gettysburg Campaign and military aspects of the Civil War, to the stories of race and religion and medicine and faith and all the intersections of the political and social sides of the Civil War as well. And so we're going to get into some of those subjects here this evening. We're going to go generally chronologically, kind of from the antebellum period through the war and into the Reconstruction and legacy of the Civil War, looking at the Civil War's impact on York County. We'll get to as many topics as we can as we go through. I want to introduce our speakers and open it up to a few questions with them. First speaker we have this evening, first guest, is James McClure. He is the retired editor of the York Daily Record, New York Sunday News, and the USA Today Network's state editor for Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. He previously served as the East Region editor for Digital First Media. He holds a master's degree in American Studies from Penn State Harrisburg, where his research focus was on York County journalism history. He is the author or co-author of 9 books on York County history, a past president of the Pennsylvania Associated Press managing editors, and led the York Daily Record and York Sunday News history team that won 2 G. Richard Dew Awards for journalistic service, which is Pennsylvania's most prestigious honor for outstanding journalism. Our other guest this evening, co-author of the book, is Scott Mingus. He's a retired scientist and executive in the global pulp and paper industry. He's an Ohio native who holds patents in self-adhesive postage stamps and barcode labels. He was part of the research team that developed the first commercially successful self-adhesive US postage stamps, maintains a popular blog, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, on the Civil War history of York County. You can find that at yorkblog.com/cannonball. He has done some pieces on Seminary Ridge Museum there. Scott received the Heritage Profile Award from York County History Center for his many contributions to local Civil War history. He has also written 6 scenario books on miniature wargaming and was elected to the hobby's prestigious Legion of Honor. Scott's great-great-grandfather was a 15-year-old drummer boy for the 51st Ohio Infantry in the Western Theater of the Civil War. He has other families who fought in the Army of the Potomac, 7th West Virginia Infantry at Antietam and Gettysburg. And so without further ado, I'll bring Jim and Scott into the discussion. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here this evening. It's a pleasure to have you. Now, to kind of get things started here, you both have published many articles, books on Civil War history, especially on subjects pertaining to York County's role in the conflict, in the Gettysburg Campaign. What was the inspiration behind compiling this new collection of perspectives for the Dogs of War in our midst?
Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that really, and we can talk about this as we go, but that really the Civil War studies in York County is only about 25 years old, maybe a little further back if you want to stretch it that way. And so a lot of the last 2 decades have been to kind of accumulate the facts and try to understand the facts behind the Civil War, the stories behind the Civil War. But this book, one of the reasons we went into this book is, what does it all mean? So there hasn't been a book on the perspectives where you try to overlay the question, what does it mean? And that's one of the reasons why we got into this project.
Yeah, I think to add to that is the book's kind of interesting flow because Jim obviously offers a lot of the professional journalism and the interpretive look, and being more of a narrative history person, I wrote some of the pieces I wrote are more what happened, where Jim talks a lot about why it happened. But to his point, that combination's never been done before because I've never really tackled the why behind in any of my books before. So we think this is rather unique.
Yeah, and Codie, we thank you for writing the foreword for the book.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. And I think it does tie to the Seminary Ridge Museum in that, you know, this book really does talk about the York story is about the moral dimensions of the war. A lot going on there, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a few minutes.
And that is one thing I forgot to mention in my introduction is that I was privileged to write the foreword, and I'm really appreciative to both Jim and Scott, both of you, for inviting me to be able to do that. I'm a native of York County and grew up not far from the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission marker on Route 462, talking about Early's passage through York. Often on my way to baseball practice, would pass a house on Taxville Road with some Civil War connections and a wooden sculpture of a soldier and a dog, and was born on the 130th anniversary of the burning of the Wrightsville Bridge, born in York County. And so destined to find these connections, and was really privileged, really proud to have been able to take part in the project. Now, in terms of the content of the book, I guess the first place we'll go here is we are, of course, in the midst of Black History Month here in February. And so let's look at an important lens through the lens of kind of the African-American experience in the Civil War era. In one of the book's first articles, which is kind of an adaptation of the foreword to Scott's recently published Guiding Lights Underground Railroad Conductors in York County, in one of the first essays in this book, Jim provides an overview of the Underground Railroad in York County, and then later in the book covers some aspect of the Goodridge family, in particular, its experiences. Talk a bit about the Underground Railroad in York County, who was involved, how successful was it, if we can measure that, and where it operated throughout the county.
Go ahead, Scott.
Thank you. Yeah, obviously, if you can see on my screen, I've got a map that I had Steve Stanley, former resident of Gettysburg, in fact, now lives in Florida, drew this map for me a few years ago for one of my books. But it gives an idea that there were 5 main routes that went into York County. And if you start on the left, of course, that route went through Gettysburg. And so the story of the Underground Railroad in Adams County is inextricably linked to the story of the Underground Railroad in Cumberland County, as well as here in York County, because these routes obviously weren't stagnant routes, nor did they stay in any one particular location. Because the key, of course, was to get most of these freedom seekers across the Susquehanna River at some point in time and get them to Eastern Pennsylvania or Northern Pennsylvania. And then, of course, ultimately, as the years progressed, because the drive became to get them to Canada. So if you look on this map, it shows all these key routes. So US Route 30 was, of course, heavily involved. Today's US Route 30. You had various routes that came into Adams County, and only show just the one that led directly from the south from the Frederick area, but there were certainly routes that came into Adams County from other venues in Maryland as well. But the bottom line on this, particularly in York County, and I think it's the one point that Jim and I have discussed multiple times, is the fact that this was a very eclectic group of conductors and agents, if you will. We had Quakers that started the movement as early as the early 1800s, very early 1800s, along the river, all the way to free Black individuals. We had Germans, we had political figures, the United States Congressman, the sheriff of York County was involved in this movement. We had poor dirt farmers, we had leading citizens in Hanover. We had one of the leading bankers, and in fact, the chief burgess of the town at one point, Jacob Wirt, was involved in the Underground Railroad. So this is a very, very interesting exercise where you stop and think, and we have documentation that often these groups, there may have been a free Black group, a free German group, a free Quaker group, but they came together quite often to move people in and out of the county. And, you know, they didn't worry about race. They didn't worry about religion. They didn't worry about, you know, wealth, status in the community, position, job, anything like that. What they worried about was how do we move these freedom seekers out of York County as fast as we can. So to us, that's one of the telling stories of York County in the Underground Railroad movement, where a lot of places you see it's only the Quakers or maybe only the Free Blacks, or maybe some other group or a church group, whatever, that is doing the movement. Here, it's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, and there's an intentionality, and I've edited both of Scott's Underground Railroad books, and there's a real intentionality there to tell those stories of the Black conductors. And fortunately, there is, at least in the case of Samuel Berry, you'll see down in Shrewsbury, his daughter, Amanda Berry Smith, wrote extensive memoirs. So there's a connection there, so we can understand more what went on there. But when you read Scott's work, you will read about an eclectic bunch, no question about that. A brave eclectic bunch.
Kind of keeping in that vein.
Yeah, and I think one of the questions you asked, Cody, as well, is how successful it was.
Yeah.
We have no clue how many people came through York County. I've seen estimates up as high as 6,000. I think, Jim, you may have even seen numbers that are even higher than that. Realistically, let's assume 3,000 or 4,000, maybe more. But how successful? I can only document a handful of freedom seekers in York County that were recaptured. So this was very successful. The success rate's sky high. So once they got involved with the Underground Railroad network, in York County, they almost never got recaptured because they were pretty efficient. And you can just see I have a list in both books of some 50 to 55 names of individuals that we know were involved in the Underground Railroad. We think that's probably just a fraction of the total number. But this was a very successful endeavor. You really didn't get recaptured north of the Mason-Dixon line, at least in this part of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and one thing that, and I know you have that map, and I think on your second floor there, the 1860 map that shows where enslaved people are in the eastern United States.
Oh yeah, I didn't put that on here, Jim.
Yeah, we should have anyway, but I can just explain it. If you see where Stewartstown is, that's Harford County. And I think Harford County's numbers were 8.6% of that population, overall population were enslaved. And under Berry, that's Baltimore County, and it was 3 to 5%. And then you go the next county down, like Howard County, it's like 28% are enslaved of the total population. So you're basically a day's walk from northern Maryland there to Free Soil in York County, and then you would head across either north through Harrisburg or more likely across the river to Philadelphia. So the bottom line is that York County is, you can see that broad footprint in the Mason-Dixon line. It's 45 miles now. It was 65 miles when Adams County is part of York County. That's a large exposure to the south. And so, and that had its own stories that caused that we can get into later on. But we were proximate to a lot of enslaved people.
Certainly. And that's a story that, visitors, as our members know, watching this, are visitors to Seminary Ridge. The story of Adams County, very similar to that of York County, having this line between slavery and freedom just a few miles to the south, and how precarious these crossroads towns are in these regions where so many freedom seekers are coming through, and free people in these counties and white people have exposure to the things connected to slavery. Now, one of those things socially that is really impacted by thoughts over slavery and emancipation is the fracturing of church denominations across the United States in the Civil War era. And this is a very big takeaway for people when they come to Seminary Ridge, is looking at the fracturing of churches. In an article in this book, Jim, you have titled "York Churches Had Their Own Civil Wars." How did the conflict, its causes, its consequences lead to religious divisions throughout York County?
Yeah, it was divisive in the churches as it was everywhere else in communities and in the nation. One of the, and there was a kind of a fatigue as far as divisions go too, because there was in 1850s, Charlie Gladfelder wrote a lot about this. In 1850s, there was a language division. Should be German, should services be in German, should be in English, or divisions in the churches, in the Lutheran churches in that case. And then also there was a high church, low church division that happened about that same time. Mercersburg Academy, Mercersburg Theological Seminary over in Franklin County. There's a couple theologians there, Schaff and Nevin, who introduced a kind of a high church perspective in the German Reformed Church. Is now United Church of Christ, but German Reformed Church. And you can see that circle there does cover the church, one of the German Reformed churches involved. So there's battles in the churches. Should you split the chancel? Should you have the altar at the back of the chancel or the front of the those types of things. But of course, we're talking about the issue of the North and the South here. And so that was yet another thing. So people were a little fragile at that point. And I'll just give three examples of three quick examples of this. In the Methodist church in town, there was a union man. He said he was a union man, a pastor who was a union man. He said, I'm a union man. He said, but we ought to let the South alone. So that's a Copperhead position there. And, some members, if you're abolitionists, you wouldn't like that position. You would want to free the slaves. So we'll talk more and more about, the different positions as we go. But that was a case. He then said bad things about his congregation publicly, and then they voted with their offering and kicked him out. There was another Presbyterian pastor in town by the name of Street. He got into an altercation on with a guy that he felt was a pro-slavery person, and actually it ended in fisticuffs, and he was able to get out of legal custody in time to preach a sermon the next day. So there's a case of an abolitionist. And then that church that we see there at in the lower right had a pastor named Miller. He was from the South. His wife was from the South. We're not sure what his position was on slavery, but by implication, some members of the church, including the small family, the most prominent family in town, left to go to the Presbyterian church. So, churches were divided, and it just like the rest of the community was. It was a big time in churches. We think churches are divided today, and we just need to think back into the 1850s, 1860s to see maybe arguably more fracturing.
And along those lines of the German language issue that you had mentioned there, that as some folks might be aware, here at the seminary, Samuel Schmucker, the founder and first president, when he brings the seminary to Gettysburg, the existing Lutheran church in town was St. James, and it was predominantly German speaking. And when Schmucker proposes English speaking services for his students who may not be familiar with foreign languages yet, the idea is really controversial, and it brings that about Christ Lutheran Church in Gettysburg, which becomes known as the college church, and that becomes the English speaking church. So those issues, even aside from the traditional causes of the Civil War that we look at, the other social matters, language barriers of the 19th century, fracturing these churches everywhere, as we can see. Another interesting church connection between York County and the seminary is that in Lower Windsor Township, there was a Lutheran church in the 18th century that gifted the Gettysburg Seminary a bell to be placed in its new cupola. And we don't know whatever happened to that bell, but it was apparently christened in the 18th century at this church in Lower Windsor Township by being basically lifted upside down, and lager beer was poured into it, and the churchgoers would drink beer out of this bell. And there's a newspaper article in the 1880s that says that it was referred to as being duly christened, and was referred to as the beer lager bell, and that came from York. Now, kind of moving along with the coming of the Civil War, Scott, you write really extensively in a piece in the book called "The Civil War Politics of York County," kind of going up to the war and then through each year of the conflict, looking politically at the makeup of York County. So just talk a bit about voting tendencies, partisan influences, party alliances, editorial biases in York's newspapers, Who were some of the influential York political voices? Anything along those lines?
Yeah, let me very quickly to begin with. When I moved here in 2001 from Cleveland, Ohio, at the time, obviously a Browns and Bengals fan, I noticed right away that York County was kind of divided. The closer I was to Harrisburg in northern York County, I saw a lot more Steelers bumper stickers. As I went close to Wrightsville towards the river, I saw a lot more Eagles bumper stickers, and most of the county was Ravens country, which of course for a Browns fan wasn't really great. But what was fascinating to me, being a sports nut, was to realize that was the politics of York County throughout much of York County's history. That the closer you were to the northern parts of York County, the closer tied you were to Pittsburgh and Harrisburg, then and now. The closer you were to the river, you were more tied into Philadelphia and their politics. But much of York County, as Jim uses the phrase, we're in North-South County, that much of the county was related to Baltimore. And that really played out very much. And so let me show you, because with that lead in, let me show you the chart of 1860 election. Here in red are the townships in York County that voted for Abraham Lincoln. In blue are the townships that voted for John C. Breckinridge, Vice President of the United States and a Southern Democrat. And again, you can see that the majority of the county, particularly the interior of the county, with a very slight vote in Springfield Township notwithstanding, this was predominantly a blue township. In fact, it voted, if I'm not mistaken, Jim, you can chime in on this, but I think every single election throughout the 19th century, the Democrats took York County in the presidential election. So this was an interesting dynamic. In fact, if you look in the lower left corner, right bordering Adams County, is West Manheim Township. 175 votes in Manheim Township for John C. Breckinridge, 2 for Abraham Lincoln, 2. Just goes to show. But farther north you got, the percentages changed. There were some 25 or 30 people in North Cadorce, for example. There was maybe 50 in Jackson Township that voted for Lincoln. So the farther north you got, the more Lincoln-esque, if you will, and again, closer to the river, because of these geographic and political and economic, as well as some ethnic ties to those particular regions. So, and I think, this goes to show that, this area was quite interesting, because when the Confederates come in, most of their entry points are in highly Southern Democrat areas where the, to use the phrase Jim used earlier, the Copperhead element was more higher in those particular areas. Jim, you want to add anything about that? Because this also ties into the newspapers of the day.
Yeah. You all, just to make sure we're clear. I mean, there's 3 basic groups of people, at least in Pennsylvania and maybe broader. You had the abolitionists, wanted to abolish slavery. You had those in the South, who adamantly wanted to keep it the same and were willing to go to war over it. And then there's this middle group called Copperheads. They, because they looked harmless, but they had a big bite, was why they were called Copperheads. And they were often in border areas like York County. And what they wanted, they're basically peace Democrats, and they wanted to negotiate a peace, which would have left the enslaved people where they were. And but York Countyans were okay with that. The majority of York Countyans voted for Lincoln, against Lincoln both times in 1868 to 1864. Scott's covered some of that, but an interesting thing was in 1864, the soldiers voted, as we know, and they voted for Lincoln. So we had an interesting kind of inconsistency there. I think in generally, York Countyans felt like they wanted to hate the war but love the warrior, because a lot of York Countyans did serve, they did die, and over 600 died, and that's probably a low count. And then just one last thing, there in 1867, there was 2 David Smalls that ran against each other for Chief Burgess of York. One was David Small, the Copperhead mayor, newspaper owner. The other one was David E. Small, Republican abolitionist. Both ran for mayor, and the winner was David Small, the Copperhead. So really York County's basic position, or the York area's basic position, hadn't changed from pre-war to post-war. It was, at least we were consistent. Even
Yeah,
if
the
we
one
might be
area that
outside.
did swap is just very quickly is if you look at the red arrow, red dot in Hanover, in the sea of blue, you've got this red dot. Some people might ask why. It was actually driven by a newspaper editor, a lady by the name of Maria Leader, whose husband had died. She had taken over the newspaper, and she apparently was quite influential. She tended to be pretty Republican versus the German language Democratic newspaper that was in that region. And as you can see in the election of 1860, largely through her efforts, I've been told by a number of people who live in the Hanover region that she actually was able to deliver Hanover to Lincoln in the sea of blue, if you will, to use the modern blue red, which wasn't in place in that point. But that shows a change where Hanover had always before then been fairly Democratic, and it certainly swapped to being Republican during the war.
Let's jump ahead a little bit into the war itself. The Gettysburg Campaign in particular, of course, is the moment at which York is perhaps most famous for its contributions to the Civil War. And you've both written extensively on the military maneuvers of that summer of 1863, their impact on the people of York County, including in some contributions in this book to Albert Jenkins' cavalry raid, Jubal Early's occupation of York, the surrender of York. What new interpretations, revelations, information on York's role in the Gettysburg Campaign in particular have either of you unearthed in preparation for these perspectives? Anything that you had not previously known in earlier publications of yours?
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll just take it. That's a really good question, and I thought about that a lot over the course of doing this. And we did some technical stuff, like we were able to compare some lists and found out how many York African Americans served in 54th Massachusetts, about half a dozen. It's hard to really pin it, but at least a half a dozen USCT troops were in the 54th. And we did some other things like clarify, the technical stuff like that. But one of the things that I thought a lot about was whether there's a term called nut picking, and that's when you find someone that is kind of crazy, and then you extend that. This is a modern term. Then you extend those attributes to everybody else in, let's say, a political party. You see that a lot on Fox News and CNN. That's kind of the way the world operates nowadays. You find an egregious example and you say everybody's like that. And I was trying to figure whether I was doing that in the case of, let's say, of A.B. Farquhar, who was the guy that surrendered, did the preliminary surrender. York went out and met the Confederates, John B. Gordon's troops and farmers as they were coming in, met them there. And he met them actually in Abbottstown, but then the town's fathers came back in there, and farmers in York County and surrendered the town, officially surrendered the town. So A.B. Farquhar was being unfair to him, because he was kind of young and enthusiastic, and had maybe some self-interest that he was trying to protect, and but there's so many other things that kind of impeached him that I felt was that the criticisms of him were fair. Then I also thought a lot about presentism, the idea of taking what we know today and then working backwards from a moral point of view, and kind of putting our understanding into place in those days. And again, I didn't think that was unfair, because there was, the Copperhead doctrine, the Union as it is, the Negroes where they are, the Constitution as it is, was that mantra was so loud that, I don't think there's a way to kind of negotiate that away. So I think it caused me to think whether past positions were fair. And, so that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, and one thing I'll quickly add is that we're in the process of finalizing the graphic layout for a new 2-volume set that Eric Wittenberg and I wrote on the Gettysburg Campaign day by day. And one of the things I included in that deliberately, and it ties right into the research on this book, is I wanted to look at how did every other community in Pennsylvania react when the Confederates came to their town. So actually deliberately in the upcoming this 2-volume set, I will include every single case of the Confederates interacting with, like David Kendallhart here in Gettysburg on June 26th, that kind of interaction, because I want to compare and contrast how York reacted to Carlisle, to Greencastle, to Mercersburg, to Chambersburg, to Gettysburg, Hanover, Wrightsville, Dillsburg, you name it. And so we're going to cover a lot of that in the new thing. But so one of the things that was for me interesting was we wrote this book and Jim worked on some of the perspectives, is York's relationship was kind of unique in the standpoint that it was forced by a businessman who on his own rode out to meet the Confederates and kind of, made city council, if you will, follow suit. They rode out. And yet this is the only town, I think, in Pennsylvania where everybody leaves town to go find the Confederates as opposed to letting the Confederates ride into town. So that reinforced, I think, something that I think we knew, but we really had never taken a comprehensive look at that before.
Wonderful. Yeah. One of the lasting results of the Gettysburg campaign, of course, upon York County and the city of York in particular, is the General Hospital, the U.S. Army General Hospital, which Scott writes extensively about in a piece called simply York's U.S. Army General Hospital in the Gettysburg Campaign. A handful of soldiers who were treated at the seminary hospital here are transferred the 30 or so miles east to York. 6 of these men who were treated at the seminary are treated in New York eventually. All 6, remarkably, were head wounds. And even more remarkably, I think, is the fact that 5 out of the 6 men survive. The soldier who dies was Charles Harpstrutt of the 74th Pennsylvania and 11th Corps Regiment. But 5 out of 6 men treated at the seminary hospital survived their wounds to the York General Hospital. Scott, if you could talk a bit about the hospital itself, size, location, details about its operations and origins.
Yeah, sure. Back to another Gettysburg tie-in. Penn Common, or Penn as it was known back then, now known as Penn Park, is a park in York directly opposite William Penn High School on the south side of town. It was land that was given by Springett Penn and some of the other members of the Penn family to the borough of York in the very early days after its founding. That land was used by the United States government at the start of the Civil War as a training ground for the 6th New York Cavalry, who was commanded by Colonel Thomas Devon. There's your Gettysburg connection. Tom Devon, of course, commanded a brigade at Gettysburg out on Seminary Ridge originally. And then, of course, those men of Buford's command ended up going way out of town to the west. But so Colonel Devon and his men, the 6th New York Cavalry, were trained in York. When they moved to the front in March of 1863, townspeople wanted to save the buildings, and they sent a U.S. Army inspector named Putnam to York. He agreed with them, and they saved the buildings. Well, that summer, good thing they did, 62, not 63, but they ended up using these buildings, repurposing them in late June of 1862 for wounded soldiers that were coming in from the Peninsula Campaign. By the end of that year, there were 1,000 beds in the York Hospital. By the Gettysburg Campaign, that expanded to 1,600 beds, and by the end of the Civil War, it's 2,000 beds, making York one of the 5 largest Civil War hospitals in Pennsylvania. 14,000 wounded men were treated here during the war. Less than 200, it was about 193, 194, number varies a little bit. But less than 200 men died in the York Hospital of their wounds, an amazingly low mortality rate. After the Battle of Gettysburg, 11,000 wounded from Gettysburg, from Camp Letterman, from the field hospitals, et cetera, were brought to York County by rail on their way to Baltimore, Philadelphia, et cetera. 1,000 of those wounded ended up in York. They evacuated most of the wounded who were already here in the hospital to other locations and freed the beds up for the wounded people to come from Gettysburg, as well as overflow from the local Oddfellows Hall that they rented for $75 to treat the Confederate wounded and some of the Union wounded. So This is a remarkable facility. There were 32 out of the 1,000 wounded from Gettysburg that died here in York that were buried in Prospect Hill Cemetery. A couple of those were removed later by their families coming up. But it's one of the things we talk about here in York when we do tours for the York County History Center, et cetera, is the fact that we have our own Gettysburg dead that are buried here. Obviously not like the numbers of dead that are buried in Adams County, but it just shows that people that were wounded at Gettysburg Seminary, wherever else, ended up in a lot of places in Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland before finally expiring or getting better. Jim, you want to add anything?
No, that covers it well. That's great.
I'll note for our viewers right now, as we wind down to our last couple of questions that I have, if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. If you wanted to send a Facebook message, or we'll unmute folks at the end here to ask some questions. But if you're thinking of any questions, feel free to go ahead and leave those there in the chat. Let's move forward toward the end of the war. Let's talk a bit about the veteran experience in York County. We can tie in certainly, Scott, the end of the war, of course, bringing about the assassination of Lincoln. We can talk a bit about the Lincoln funeral train, but also directed to you both. You write a lot about in the book about contributions to the United States war effort by York County's soldiers, including some who fought in very famous regiments like the 54th Massachusetts, made famous by the 1989 film Glory. So what role does the Lincoln funeral train, and then in the aftermath of the war, what role do Civil War veterans play in York County? Did they have Grand Army of the Republic posts? Was there a place for Black veterans alongside their fellow white veterans?
Great. I'll take the first part of that. And then Jim, if you don't mind, you can take the veterans posts. Abraham Lincoln's funeral train came through York on the afternoon of April 21st, 1862, on its way to Harrisburg. It actually stopped in York for a mandatory water and fuel stop, as did almost every train regular that ran between York and Baltimore on the Northern Central Railway. Today's rail trail, if you will, for folks who are familiar with York County. This funeral train operating between 10 and 20 miles an hour throughout its route. But what's fascinating to me, it goes back to the politics, is again, if you start on this map, places like Strasburg, that's Shrewsbury, Sisseling, Gun Rock, Hanover Junction, Smizers, Gladfelders, almost every single one of the train stations is in a heavily Republican or heavily Democratic area. So this is an area that did not vote for Abraham Lincoln at all, and did not support him whatsoever. And yet when his body comes through this area, the tracks all along Southern York County, the tracks are lined with people in mourning clothes who, despite not voting for this guy twice, are willing to put on their Sunday best mourning clothes. They go out in a rainstorm, and they're standing hat in hand, bareheaded in the rain to watch the funeral car go by for a fleeting glimpse, 20 miles an hour, it just rolls by and it's gone. And yet they took the time to go honor the following, because they honored the office of the presidency. Maybe some of them, of course, honored the memory of the man himself, but a lot of these folks simply, had never voted for him, yet here they are, lining the roads. And in York Borough itself, 5,000-6,000 people show up in downtown at the train station. Again, in a town that did not vote for Lincoln, to wish his body well, if you will, and see him off to Harrisburg. So Jim, you want anything quickly on the funeral train before you mention the post?
No, that was good. I'll just go into the post if you want to. There were several GAR posts throughout York County, of course. I think Charles Gladfelder counted 6,000 veterans from York County, or 6,000 who served in uniform from York County. That's a lot of people. So there's a lot of veterans. In particular, the white post was named the Sedgwick Post after the Union general, and the black post, the black veterans, African American veterans, was named the David E. Small Post. I mentioned him a little bit earlier, not the David Small, the Copperhead David Small, but the David E. Small Post. And there were times that they would march on Memorial Days, they would march. In York, there's a Prospect Hill Cemetery. It's a historically white cemetery. And then there's the Lebanon Cemetery, which is further out from town. So the two groups would march really in the same column. And then the white veterans from the Sedgwick Post would veer to the left to go to Prospect Hill Cemetery. This is off of George Street today. And then the black veterans would march another half mile to the Lebanon Cemetery. So the two were equal in some ways, but then they divided and went to the respective segregated cemeteries to have their respective Memorial Day services.
One thing. Oh, go ahead, Cody.
No, go right ahead, Scott.
Yeah, one thing just to add quickly for Jim. It's interesting to me that the last two Civil War veterans to die in York County who were from York County, one was a white man in downtown York by the name of John Ike, E-I-C-H, and the last veteran to die in York County, again, who had been born in York County, was a black man in the southeastern part of the county, John Aquila Wilson, who had served in the defense of the bridge at Wrightsville and later served in one of the United States Colored Troops regiments. And so even to the very end of this county, you had black and white veterans that, shared within a matter of a few years of being the last men to die in York County.
And the two are pictured together in a famous picture with a Lincoln impersonator. They're about within a year of their deaths.
Back of the book here for our viewers there.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the role of veterans and the conversations that they had, the roles that they played in society and in their communities, all really kind of forms the basis of memory as we see it today. And Americans have a very collective memory of the Civil War. It's very emotional. Controversies surrounding it are cyclical. They come back around each generation, and sometimes, of course, even more frequently than that. And it seems like we're all always trying to find answers to the questions that the wartime generation itself left unresolved. Through a handful of articles in the book, Jim, you cover some contemporary views in favor and against Lincoln, links between Reconstruction era elections and contested elections, that are in our common psyche today. You look at lingering Civil War debates in York County, how people handle the controversial decisions that historical actors made. And toward the end of the book, you have a host of quotations by both contemporary and modern sources on the conflict's impact throughout the region. How would you gauge, I'll direct this to Jim first here, Scott, feel free to jump in. How would you gauge how the Civil War has been or should be best remembered in York County? Do you have a favorite quotation or reflection from that article at the end of the book that you think summarizes it best?
Yeah, this is a big question here, and there's a lot to this, but I'll try to do the Reader Digest version of it. The surrender was controversial in its day, controversial even now. People still like to argue about it if they're aware of it, and that's part of the story here. Is that in York County, there's a great American Revolution story. The Art of Confederation were adopted in York, and then there's a great World War II story. And, so the county and the town in particular, York area, has kind of voted for the first and the third stories. The Civil War story isn't really as intriguing because there's a surrender involved. So it hasn't really been a point of discussion and throughout most of the 20th century, there was little discussion on it. And the thing is, when you don't talk about the Civil War, bound to that is the topic of race. So if you're not talking about the Civil War, you're not talking about race. And I think York County is behind in that topic. But with some of the recent Civil War studies, I think we're catching up in understanding the Civil War better. In fact, there's more Civil War discussion going on now in York County than there is about the American Revolution, which is a long time staple. In terms of quotes, I just think that this famous quote by A.B. Farquhar, that we mentioned a couple of times, who said in his autobiography, written only 100 years ago, he was a successful industrialist of his day, and he said York County in the Civil War was distinctively Northern, but not bitterly anti-Southern. So you can see a negotiation there. And then he goes on to say, at the same time being acquainted with many slave owners, we also knew that slavery is better in practice than in theory, and that the planter who was cruel to his Negroes was a rare exception. No matter what his personal disposition might be, slaves were so very expensive that it would be ridiculous to maltreat them as to maltreat a stable of blooded horses. So that was the Mr. Big in town 100 years ago. And that pretty well maybe exemplifies the mindset in your county, maybe among some even to this day, where, you know, we don't see ourselves necessarily as a Northern county. I would say we're a Northern county with a Southern exposure, or a Southern county with a Northern exposure, and so that quote I just read kind of typifies your county over from 1863 and before to this day, although I think that there'd be more people that would disagree with him today than there were 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Scott, do you have anything to add on memory of the Civil War in York County?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've been trying to do the last few years, and Jim and I have chatted about this, is to try to bring York's entire story back to life. I mean, obviously the surrender, I think, dominated a lot of stuff. When I moved here in 2001, other than some of the work Jim had done at that point, there wasn't a lot done on York County Civil War history. And of course, I kind of raised my hand and volunteered to get started on changing some of that. But we've been recently putting in more and more Civil War trails markers, for example, to tell the story. We put 4 in Wrightsville just in the last year and a half, to try to tell the other stories, the story of, the Underground Railroad in York County. 2 of those 4 markers are on the Underground Railroad, because to Jim's point, we never talk about that. And yet that is one of York County's biggest legacies. Is some people would argue that the term Underground Railroad even began in York and Lancaster counties way back as early as the turn of the 19th century. So, that's a story that needs to be told. Hanover's put a remarkable number of markers up in the last year on all aspects of their history: industry, religion, Civil War, etc. So there's a lot of stories to be told here. And I think, in the next 5 years to come, hopefully, as people will look back 5 years from now, they'll say that this was a pretty holistic county where, a surrender happened, but an awful lot of other things happened here as well.
And the last question that I'll ask, and we'll open it up to anybody who has some here, and that segues right in, Scott, is what are your favorite places in your county to go to understand the conflict's impact on your county? And what is your recommendation if someone was going to go trek through York, look for its Civil War sites? Where do you recommend that they begin? And I'll ask that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I'll give you a quick little anecdote. I had an editor of a major national magazine call me up a few weeks ago, wanting me to write a piece on the Wrightsville Bridge. And his opening words are, "Hey, Scott, you're the Wrightsville guy." So obviously that's my favorite place in York County. I've spent a lot of time there. My first Civil War book was about the burning of the Wrightsville Bridge and that defense. That's an area, of course, that I think is rife for more tourism. You got the Susquehanna River there. You got great restaurants. The town's going to be reinventing itself, as has Columbia already on the other side of the river. So that's certainly one of my favorite and probably most unsung areas for people to come visit as well. Hanover Junction is another great Civil War site here in York that we haven't talked much about, but that's where the railroad that ran to Gettysburg, of course, that Abraham Lincoln used to reach Gettysburg from York County, and came back, of course, after giving the Gettysburg Address through that area. That train station's a great little museum now, and is another place I think people should definitely visit when they come to York County, as well as I previously mentioned Hanover, where they're doing a fine job now of reinterpreting what's happening in that town, Civil War wise and history wise. Jim, you want to add any?
Yeah, I like some of the sites around York. One of them is the William C. Goodrich Freedom Center, which is a site of conscience like the Seminary Ridge Museum. And there's actually a basement there dug out that, that clearly was used for, an underground railroad. William C. Goodrich has proven to be a station master on the railroad. So one of the things that's coming up, there's something like 10 different museums or initiatives underway that deal with history and culture in York County. One, the Crispus Attucks, the African American organization in town, is planning a cultural center. The York County History Center is planning a brand new museum that's going to have a Civil War component to it, obviously.
We have a new museum in Hanover.
New museum in Hanover. Out in Wrightsville, Scott's area, the Mifflin House that Scott's done a lot of work on, is the Underground Railroad Museum. That has been announced, but that's going to become a welcome center under the Susquehanna Heritage Program. So there's at least 6 other things that are opening, all in time for the 250th of the Declaration and the 250th of the Articles of Confederation. So it's a kind of the golden age of history and culture studies in York County.
Wonderful. And as our viewers might be aware, if you go to Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center YouTube page, our Beyond the Ridge series, I think it was three videos in York County, Hanover Junction, downtown York, and Wrightsville. And so again, that crossover between York County and the stories of Seminary Ridge. We can open it up to any questions that our viewers might have. Rob, if you want to guide the ship on that, feel free. Looks like we might have at least one in the comment there.
That's the one that I see. Were there any major war industries in York County?
Yeah, there were actually quite a few. Number one, of course, I came to York County because I was recruited by a local paper mill. Well, that paper industry here in York County was quite active before the Civil War. And a large number of military paper, if you will, was produced here in York County. Early on, at one point, Congress's paper was made here in York County in the earlier part of the 18th or 19th century. So the paper industry was quite active in this area. You had a number of other rolling industries that supported, for example, the iron industry, things like that. Carriage making, there were people in this county that were manufacturing blankets and whips and things like that for the Army use as well. Jim, you want to comment there? I know there's quite a few others.
Yeah, York was positioned on the Monocacy Road, or the main road down through from Germantown through York, down Harper's Ferry, down the Shenandoah Valley. So you'd have wagon makers all along that road, gunsmiths, gun makers along that road. But really, and Scott mentioned this briefly, the milling was a big deal, and particularly flour milling. And that's what Juba Early in part was going after. He wanted to capture the big fat mills of the Smalls family, and did. And that's why his requisition when he came to town was so steep, because he knew York County could provide it.
It's the only question I see there. Does anybody else have any questions for Jim or Scott? As anybody might be thinking of it, I'll ask one more here. What other new books or projects would you guys like to plug? What have you been working on? What are you working on next?
Yeah, just very quickly then, my newest book, believe it or not, this isn't my newest book. My newest book is on the Lincoln funeral train. So I took the little essay that I wrote on the funeral train here in York County and said, there's a bigger book here. I should do all of Pennsylvania. So that's now out. And I wanted to get that out in the public's hand before the April reenactment events and the commemoration of the Lincoln funeral train. And then, as I alluded to just briefly earlier, Eric Wittenberg and I have a 2-volume set from Savas Beatty coming out where we look at the Gettysburg Campaign day by day. And something rather unique about that is unlike redoing Here Come the Rebels by Wilbur Nye or one of these other Coddington, one of these other books, we wanted to do something a little different. So Eric and I took a hard look at the politics behind the Gettysburg Campaign, as well as media coverage. So I'm sure Jim, you will appreciate this. I took a really hard look at English, French, and Canadian newspapers through newspapers.com and other sources, and looked at the coverage internationally as well as nationally, both in the North and South. How did the media react to the Gettysburg Campaign as things were going on? How did the civilians react? What was going on beyond this guy moved here and fought this battle at Brandy Station? We wanted to tell the whole story of what was going on. So Eric and I I think this 2-volume set, we've got Ted Savis really excited because it's a really a fresh take on the campaign. Jim, anything else?
I'm working on, in 1999, I did a general history of York County, the first that had been done in a number of years, and that none have been done since. So I'm going to update my general, it's called Never Be Forgotten. I'm going to update that in time for these big anniversaries we have coming up. So it'll be a major effort to bring in new information and development since 1999.
We just had another comment here. Any interesting takeaways that you found from your research for this book or on York County? It's the research in particular.
Yeah, well, like I said, for me, the biggest revelation not being in York County was, I alluded to my funny story earlier about the politics being so tied into sports in modern times. But I think that was, to me, the biggest revelation as we dove into this is, particularly as I wrote my article in there on the politics of York County, is just how much things haven't changed. Where we like to think things have changed over the years, they really haven't in a lot of ways. People stick to their knitting, if you will. And so we've got a lot of folks in York County that have traditions and, they have longstanding loyalties and allegiances, many of which are staying put. And so that's an interesting, so, we tend to be, like I said, somewhat liberal in some of our thoughts, but certainly conservative in a lot of other ways.
Yeah, and I've just been interested in the a growing interest in York County. Originally had 65 miles of the Mason-Dixon line. I think initially the Mason-Dixon line was 233 miles. So in Lancaster had about 23 miles. So York County had 65. So how does that shape York County? And I just think it's kind of the consummate border county, and we've had trouble just really drawing a line in the sand because there's so many forces that we're dealing with, southern forces, northern forces, and so we have a hard time saying this is right and this is wrong. And that was the case of the surrender. And as a newspaper guy, I've always been interested in how that pays forward and how in other times of our history that has happened, where we could have done the right thing and we didn't, because we just couldn't see it because there's too many competing things. And so I think our geography has helped shape us maybe more than if you were somewhere else in Pennsylvania. And so that's an area I continue to think about and probably will be reflected in my revised and Never Be Forgotten.
Wonderful. Well, seeing no other questions, I think we'll
Go
ahead, John. Yep.
Yeah, Scott, when did you say the Lincoln funeral train book's coming out?
Oh, it's already out now. It's called A Carnival of Grief, the Lincoln Funeral Train in Pennsylvania. So you can pick up copies on Amazon or through a lot of retailers right now.
Well, maybe I'll get you to speak to the Lincoln group of DC.
Yeah, I'd love to, especially since I know your background, of course.
Yeah,
highly germane.
We also do the reenactment at Elizabethtown there,
Yeah, and I'll be signing books there, and I'll be giving talks on the Lincoln Funeral Train there.
But I also booked the speakers for the Lincoln group, so
I'd love to talk to you. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Any other final questions as we wrap up here? No? All right. Well, Jim, Scott, thank you very much for being here this evening. Thank you to all of our viewers. Check out the many books that these two gentlemen have published. I actually just looked over and I have on my shelf the first book that I had from either one of you, Civil War Voices from York County. And I remember, Scott, you signed this for me at Irvin's Books when it was still in West York there. But the new book is The Dogs of War in Our Midst, Civil War Perspectives from York County, Pennsylvania. Do you have a preferred spot that folks go to purchase?
Yeah, there's a lot of spots. I mean, obviously, Civil War and More in Mechanicsburg carries our books. TG Books, the York County History Center here in York, also carry them. Amazon, Target.com has it now listed. Walmart.com has it listed as well. So certainly wherever most people go, either in person in this region or online, you can find the book. Or you can contact Jim or I, and we'll be happy to hook you up as well.
Great, and we will have copies available soon at Seminary Ridge Museum. And
Absolutely.
in the museum shop as we reopen.
And that will be our preferred route for folks in Adams County.
Yes. Well, thank you both very much. It's been a pleasure. Look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you to our viewers.